this today is on the pilots, the bar pilots. And the bar, of course, is the build-up, the sandbar that builds up between islands when you have a gap. And that's why they call them the bar pilots. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But the whole thing about the bar at the Aransas Pass, at our Aransas Pass, not the town, it's the gap between the two islands, Mustang Island and San Jose. And that has held the name Aransas Pass for a really, really long time, even before the town. And when I was doing this research for this book, I just kept finding out more and more about the pilots. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about kind of the first three generations of pilots, not all of them. And if you ever get a chance and go on YouTube, there is a magnificent, maybe 20-minute presentation on modern-day bar pilots of Texas. And it includes three of the pilots that are here at the Aransas Corpus Christi Pilots Association. So if you get a chance on YouTube, that really brings you up to date. This starts way back. So, wild men and their wilder past, the pilots of the Aransas. There is a section of Texas marked by rolling plains that precede it and uplifted bluffs that overlook it, that sits ajar the coast. Well, turn it on. That sits ajar the coast. Evolved in the warming epochs of the last ice age, it formed as ice-melted streams buried rock and gravel, surged down peaks, through emergent marshes, and into the ocean. There the sediments lost momentum, dropped to sea bottom, collected in layers, and aeons later rose upward, breaking the water's surface. By the time Hammurabi was codifying laws in ancient Mesopotamia, Texas had lost its open Gulf and gained a string of barrier islands. Atop them, waterborne sand created beaches, and air-gusted grit dropped into hillocks, dunes, and grass-strewn mud banks that eased into marshes or flats. From there, the isles sank into quiet lagoons bordering the mainland. Propelling the air around them were winds, some fierce northers and others cyclonic hurricanes. But the most common were inter-ocean winds, longshore drifts that coursed around the islands and nourished them. During winter months, currents from upcoast flowed southwards, dropping debris along the barriers and onto their beaches. During warmer months, southeasterly currents drove northwards. Over time, their deposits refurbished island bases and reshaped them. By the time humans approached the moon-shaped bay of Corpus Christi, the barrier isles they glimpsed to their east, today's Padre, Mustang, and San Jose Islands, featured crescent-shaped deltas, marsh-laden flats, and dunes latticed with vegetation. The bays a little up coast, Redfish and Aransas, Copano, and Matagorda, offered oyster reefs solid enough to walk upon, and estuaries brimming with embryonic life. The Laguna Madre, stretching parallel to them, brought surfaces smooth as milk and almost as calm. But the Aransas Pass, that water-surging onslaught of lagoon into the sea, which turned currents into torrents and tore edges off island tips, that promised death, harsh, violent, and final. Over centuries, many, from primordial newcomers to 21st century mariners, felt the challenge of that pass, but only a few have made it their life. The first were those early newcomers to the islands, the ones who settled around 1000 BCE. It took time for them to absorb their surroundings, immediate survival, and the technology to secure it took precedence. Black drum and spotted sea trout made coastside fishing practical. Reefs within Copano and Aransas Bay provided weights for capture nets. Conchs from inland tides provided ad seeds and gouging tools. Coral whips became twisted basket strings, and mulberry bark turned into rope. Inland deer kills provided shafts for fishing spears. By the time those fishing spears evolved into bows and arrows, the people of the coast, now called Karakolas, had begun exploring the isles. Attracted to them but unable to wade the distance, they created water vehicles, boats hollowed out from oaks and then made fluid resistant. Hesitant at first, they poled themselves across the lagoons to the backsides of the isles, then sloshed ashore onto mud flats. There and inland among the hillocks they found food: sea turtle nests on the beaches, oysters in the reefs, kangaroo rats and ground squirrels in the sand dunes, slider turtles, ribbon snakes and rails among the wetlands, gulls, terns, egrets, and great blue herons in the air. Shorebirds tested their hunters' accuracy, and finfish challenged their women's nets. Time itself trained their aquatic skills until almost dolphin-like in their pirogues, the people merged with the seascape around them. The longshore drifts which pushed their boats southwards at certain times of the year and northwards at others. The currents which swept them violently through gaps if paddlers were not careful. The deltas and sandbars which shape-shifted every time a huge storm pushed through. They observed where massive reefs in the bay lay, how shorebirds nested, and when shellfish spawned. They discerned moon phases and anticipated tidal overflows. They noted air density and could tell when a tropical storm was near. For decades, the Karakolas skimmed the waters of the coast as smoothly as the fish they hunted and the birds they stalked. To late-coming chroniclers attempting to categorize them, they were little more than vagabonds, waterbound gypsies, half-tamed. But to Juan Almonte, official representative of the government of Mexico, sent to investigate Texas in 1835, they were far more. Practically reared in the water, they are excellent fishermen and good swimmers, he added, even noting they could be used advantageously in our Navy. His summary of that part of the province ended with this accolade: the Karakolas are the best pilots in Matagorda and Aransas bays. The best, but by no means the last, nor the roughest. Their successors of less than a generation later, the bar pilots of the Aransas, gloried in their reputation as hard-drinking, tobacco-spitting men in a hard-drinking place. Such men possessed a unique independence, one source noted, wholly incompatible with general obligations. They are free to act in their own best judgment. Such freedom was dearly bought, however. It was the consequence of skills as painfully learned as those of the Karakolas, but of even greater consequence. For rather than darting around the bays and within the lagoons, these pilots now had to navigate through the Aransas Pass itself, a feat as daring as it was perilous, and as goaded by technology. It was technology that first made going through the pass mandatory, for it was that which brought sail-laden ships to the Texas coast, providing techniques of hoisting canvas and catching winds, sighting stars and measuring depths, riding currents and skimming waves. Technology guided explorers to new lands and entrepreneurs to new markets. Their technology brought caravels, then bark-long, and then frigates to the Aransas Pass. But their technology balked, for invention alone could not broker passage of such large vessels from the sea through the pass to the coast. The waves that blasted between Mustang and San Jose were as vicious as they were strong, the breakers on either side of the Isles wrenching, and the pass floor itself serrated and erratic. No easy route lay between the sea and the inner bays, and the bays themselves were so shallow that none but pirogues had been able to maneuver them for years until schooners and skiffs made an appearance. Slim, light, and flatter bottomed, these could scull along the estuaries and slip into the inlets. By mid-19th century, larger and more maneuverable schooners were attempting the pass, but cargo-laden steamships with narrow hulls and outside paddle wheels did not even try. The situation was so untenable that when the United States Army landed on San Jose in the spring of 1845, all the men, baggage, and armaments had to be offloaded into river-style steamboats, smaller and wider hulled, to be carried from the Isles to Corpus Christi Bay, and even these grounded, leaving commanders quite beside themselves with anxiety, fatigue, and passion. It was up to a few good men, innovative and as adventurous as their Karakolas counterparts, to figure out how to guide substantial vessels through the Aransas Pass, and they met the challenge head on. First, they set marking poles, tall signal posts, usually flying bright banners, upon certain sites on the isle in such a way that upon arriving at the pass, helmsmen could align the poles by sight and thus trace a route through the convoluted strike. They also used the island-based lighthouse beam, extending over 15 miles, and the seafloor secured buoys government provided over the years to make crossings easier. They employed lead lines, metal alloys, tied onto knotted cords, dropped overboard, and then hauled up to read how far down from the vessel's hull the seafloor lay. But nothing eclipsed the flags, guns, and rockets used by Aransas bar pilots to guide ships safely through the pass, most especially flags. By the 1870s, these communication signals had been adopted by all major maritime powers. Knowing how to decipher them, the ball, a round fabric circle, the pennant, elongated and triangular with white, blue, red, and yellow backgrounds, and the square flag, identical backgrounds with varying designs, became mandatory for all Aransas bar pilots. The reasoning was obvious. A ship in distress, grounded on the breakers or sustaining an onboard fire, could shoot a gun at intervals or send up a rocket, but a ball flying either above or below a square flag at the topmost mast of the vessel was almost always going to be seen by coastal spotters. Just as certainly, the same ball suspended over a pennant, flying near the entrance to the pass, was a sure signal from shore pilots that the oncoming captain was approaching danger. The pass best not be tried that day. But the message most often used and the most welcome was one an incoming captain mounted on his mainmast, a ball between two pennants that said, "I want a pilot." Then all the training and study and preparation mastered over the years came into play. A small boat was grabbed, rushed to the water, and rowed to the approaching vessel. Then, gauging carefully the distance between heaving rowboat and looming ship, the pilot leapt onto the overhung rope ladder and clambered rapidly on board. From then on, with the informed consent of the captain, he shepherded the vessel through the strait. His directions immediately obeyed, his orders faithfully followed. Free to act on his own best judgment, he held the ship within his hands. But such power carries immense responsibility and risk. Maneuvering a deep-hulled vessel above a seafloor that rose and dipped 10 feet or more within a few yards was nerve-wracking. Broaching millions of cubic feet of water flowing at velocities from 6 inches to 6 feet or more per second was even more intense. Doing that in the face of violent winds, pouring rains, and unseasonable tides made the job of an Aransas bar pilot harrowing. It was the pass, however, that proved the greatest hazard. As San Jose gradually moved forward, its base buoyed by sediment-bearing waves, Mustang Islands sidled backwards, its shore decimated by the same currents. The gap between the two fluctuated in size from one year to another. Soon the prism-lit lighthouse had settled too far back to prove useful, and standard marking flags had to be reset time and time again as the isles changed shape. A movable gap between two increasingly unstable islands was as dangerous a passage as any pilot could envision. Yet the bar pilots traversed it. Their livelihood depended upon expertise and aggressiveness and a personal penchant for danger. But in between vessel sightings, they drank together and caroused together, fought over tobacco, went AWL for weeks, sponsored dogfights, raced Mustangs, visited lighthouse girls, and got decently, damnationally, ungentlemanly drunk. They even organized setting up the Bar and Bay Pilots Association by 1874 and earlier acknowledging the state as ultimate authority in their profession. For as independent and autonomous as each Aransas bar pilot was while doing his job, only his training, skills, and a certain sense of camaraderie kept him on the water. That and a creative body of engineers. By the late 1800s, it was evident that even the most skillful pilots could do nothing to forestall the fluctuating size of the pass. If significant merchandise was to be cargoed to and from the coastal bend on a regular basis, the Aransas Pass had to be stabilized and deepened. Consequently, financial interests set about constructing jetties, rock-encrusted bulwarks designed to so capture and funnel waters through the pass that solidified it would actually deepen itself with the sea's pent-up force. As the years passed, such structures like the Mansfield Jetty tried and tried again to harness the waves, only to ultimately fail. Then an edifice was built in the early 1900s that was so controversial in its design and in its results that the Army had to call in an expert to determine its worth. Their choice, Edward T. Mercer, third-generation Aransas bar pilot. In a way, this Mercer, grandson of the family's founder and son of a pilot himself, was as unlike his rough and ready forebears as any progeny could be. Completing 4 years of high school, Tom, as he was called, had turned island home sea skills to in-harbor expertise. Apprenticing with some of the most accomplished tugboat captains on the coast, Mercer had become master of 2 vessels, the Skipper and the Reliance, had conducted operations in both Texas and Louisiana seaports, and had lived at different times in Galveston, Port Arthur, and Beaumont. He was a businessman, a conscientious employer, and a dutiful bill payer, as ostensibly staid as any landlubber. But piloting had been in his blood since birth. The love of the sea, the obsession with current shifts and tidal flows, the exhilaration of running a vessel across the bar, all these were part of his nature even before tugboats, and by his late 20s, Tom Mercer was the pilot the Army chose to evaluate the effect of the controversial single-reaction breakwater jetty. As carefully as he had made notes while crossing the Galveston bar, Mercer calculated the size of the vessels that could safely traverse the Aransas Pass without hitting the controversial jetty. With light east winds and smooth seas under favorable conditions and good tide, he reported, I can at present, with the existing curved jetty channel, bring in over Aransas bar the following drafts. A vessel 100 feet long drawing or clearing 10.5 feet of water. A vessel 200 feet long drawing 9 feet. A vessel 300 feet long drawing 8 feet. A vessel 400 feet long drawing 6 feet. He continued, to follow the curve of the jetty, a vessel 100 feet long must keep at least 200 feet from the jetty. A vessel 200 feet long must keep at least 300 feet from the jetty. Anything over 200 feet cannot follow the curve of the jetty. In effect, to get through the pass, a ship had to follow the trough that the single reaction breakwater had trenched, but only smaller vessels could do that. Any ship of extended length could not adhere to the channel and maneuver through the pass without striking the jetty. To entrepreneurs counting on large freighters bringing in huge cargoes for trade, such unprofitable. To pilots used to maneuvering even the most convoluted routes, it was impractical. But to Army engineers, it was intolerable. They immediately set about redesigning the faulty single breakwater edifice into a double jetty system that worked. 5 years later, the pass between San Jose and Mustang Island had been deepened, widened, and dredged to 20 feet, its edges anchored, its seafloor smooth, and its waters funneling out between a south jetty and a north jetty, one weighing 162,000 tons, the other over 230,000 tons, and together pouring millions of cubic feet of water 6 feet per second into the Gulf. And working this newly navigable pass at Aransas were Mercer and his fellow pilots, unflappable as before, twice as active, and 3 times as challenged. For things had changed, their water routes in particular, where before they had steered vessels through the pass and onto coastal towns like Rockport and Aransas Pass. Now they headed ships toward the newly built port of Corpus Christi, 20 miles west. There they guided freighters between the spans of a frustratingly narrow bridge into a turning basin and its wharves, specifically designed to accommodate the most laden of commercial vessels. Shepherding them out again east across the bay and back through the pass demanded other changes, including tall antennas stretching high off deck to receive the radio waves and Morse code messages that had supplanted flag communication. Training had changed as well, certified pilots having to complete intensive hours of academic studies as well as years of on-sea experience to achieve the degree of master pilot. Even membership had changed. Women now included in the ranks of the Aransas Corpus Christi pilots of the Port of Corpus Christi. But 2 things had never changed and never will. The sheer courage it takes to jump from pilot boat onto a rope ladder overhanging the deck, and the pure joy of maneuvering some of the biggest vessels in the world through the Aransas Pass. One other thing will never change, the pass itself. Badgered, bolstered, anchored, and finally bulwarked, it still rules the gap between Mustang and San Jose Islands, an open challenge to the only humans who have ever dared broach it, the pilots of Aransas Pass.
Are there any questions for Mary? No, I forgot to mention too, and I apologize when I introduced you that did mention that she taught history for 29 years, and she has published 2 books. And so if you enjoy her wording and her way she spoke, you can always pick up one of her books. But are there any questions?
And when's this book going to be out?
April, eventually. This has been put off a while, but y'all know what's going on everywhere. And so it should be out in April. Thank you, Penny.
Thank you. Does the museum have the books?
We do.
No, but I was just going to talk to you about that. So
Okay.
yes.
And it's interesting because we talk about the hop jetty and the evolution of jetties, and actually we're going to bring back the Taming of the Channel exhibit next month, so that we can kind of keep an eye, because the pandemic has kind of hindered some people from seeing the present exhibit, but I think some people would like to see it again. Actually, I had George Ward come in to talk about it too, but he can't get into the building where his computer is at because of COVID on the university. But it was really interesting to hear that was one of the failures of the hop jetty was navigating it, because it was the first really well-engineered jetty, but obviously the curves provided a problem. Proved to be a major problem.
You see out in the past the pilot boats, right? So are they still jumping from the pilot boats to the main ships, or is that stopped?
But a friend of mine that I had interviewed said a lot of times now the bigger boats have something extends over like a solid ladder and then comes down. And so they still have to step up high, but they can quite often use that extended type ladder. But most of the time, I still think it's the rope ladder that's
They have to eventually get on the rope ladder. Some have stairways that they can lower down, but, you know, so there's a variety, it depends on the quality of ship. But yeah, the pilot boats have kind of developed to have kind of, I guess you might call a boarding platform. Sometimes it's to the side, sometimes it's off the bow, you know, but you still they have to run right up against the ship at the same speed that ship's running, and it can be, and they have to make sure they put the ladder or stairway down on the side that's the leeward side, because otherwise it's just too rough to even get on. But it can be, I'm sure, quite harrowing at times.
So they are still mounting the main ship that's coming through the channel and directing it from there rather than directing it from the small pilot boat.
Oh, always.
Always.
The pilot boat's run by a separate captain. He's just the ferry to get the pilot to the ship.
Yeah, do the pilots take over and run the ship, or do they tell somebody else?
They take it over and give the directions. It's with the informed consent of the captain, of the master. But they give the directions. And again, and depending on, I think one of the ones was telling me that everybody on the deck speaks English, which is very good because the pilots do. And again, they're very careful, port, starboard, left, right, that sort of thing. But it is the pilot that gives the directions.
So he doesn't physically, usually there's a wheelman.
Oh, yeah.
Even the captain isn't always on a wheel.
Sometimes we go down at sunrise and then we'll go down to the jetty and watch the boats going back and forth. And I guess I was curious, sometimes there are pilots guiding, the big ships. Sometimes there are no pilots. Sometimes there might be one. Sometimes there might be up to 3. What determines whether or not there's a pilot? Is it the size of the ship, or maybe what the cargo is?
I think what you may be mixing up is so the pilot is a separate boat. Usually it's red, it's kind of reddish orange with the tugboats. So sometimes there's 2 or 3 tugboats, because some of the ships have difficulty making that turn. So they put you a lot of times on the really big ships, especially when there's a lot of wind. They'll put a tug on the front and a tug on the back, so they can torque that ship and aid in that turn. Especially
So
if
it's
they're
to
going
do with the size of the ship, why they have as many of their tugboats, you're saying, basically.
Right.
Whether they need to have that or not. I was curious.
But there's always one pilot, and sometimes you might not see the pilot meet the ship because you might meet him several miles offshore. So, but
And he's always on the ship that he's guiding through, or she is always on the ship.
Okay.
She's guiding the ship.
Toward the last, you showed a photograph of a drawbridge. Is that gone now? Is that where the ferries?
Oh, it's so gone.
But
This was a
did it-
bascule bridge, and it was a French design, and it would, at a given signal, and it was the entrance to the port of Corpus Christi. And so one end would just lift up, and it would take that 20 minutes, and the ship would go through, and then it would go down again. And this worked, except that the city of Corpus Christi was kind of cheap, so they didn't let it be wide enough. And so every time the pilots had to go through, it was like threading a needle, and that's the phrase they used. And as the ships got wider and wider, it got scarier and scarier. And eventually, I think in 1950, I'm not sure, 49, 50, they put in the new harbor bridge, which is now being replaced. But when you go into Corpus Christi, if you go by the bridge, that's the replacement bridge for the bascule bridge. Penny,
Do you know how many women pilots we have in this area?
I I know we have, I had a couple of, I think we've got it, I know we had one, just about 2 or 3 years ago. We may have two. And then this YouTube thing I was telling y'all about, one of the women, they interview pilots from all up and down the coast, and it's really cool. And at least one of them is a woman, she's not the one from Corpus. But I think a woman, just 2 or 3 years ago, we ended up at least with one woman in Corpus.
So in addition to being Coast Guard certified as a captain, I am assuming they have to have that first. What do they have to do to be a certified pilot for the ships?
Usually, they go through some university maritime university. There's one, I think, in Galveston, I'm not sure. Yeah. And there's several others. In fact, one of the people I interviewed for this book, his grandson has just gone through it. So you need to get a large number of academic hours. So you've got to do that. And then you have to actually be on the sea. You have to be pilot. You have to do all of the actual hands-on work for years. And you kind of, gradually grade yourself up until you accomplish all the requirements. And then you still have to be invited into the Aransas Corpus Christi Pilots Association. And you don't have to end up being invited, it just may not work out. But there's so many more hours of academic studies that you have to have under your belt now. It's a lot of training. Yes?
How many pilots does it take to manage this test?
Oh, I've got this number 1245. You mean?
I know they just put on 5 or 6 more, because as the port, once they started pushing out that oil from West Texas, they added 5 to 7 more, just in the last couple of years.
I know for a while it's just kind of like just 12. And I have seen a picture of retired pilots, and there were not even that many. This was back in, I think, around 1960 or something. But they have a lot more than they did, obviously.
So are you saying that every big ship that comes through is required to have a pilot on board? Because sometimes, I see the pilot boats go out, and actually just this past week, I watched to see the pilot climb board. But sometimes, which was so much fun, but sometimes, I watched from way off, and there's no pilot boat, they just kind of come straight through, but there is a pilot on that boat?
I would think there.
As far as I know, every ship that comes through the pass has to have a pilot.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
If you're a barge
Right.
or the tugboat,
Right.
that's different. But any one of these ocean-going vessels does have to have a pilot. However, if that same vessel with the same captain has come in here 30 or 40 times, the pilot may get off. Once they make the turn, and they're between the jetties and they're going out to the sea building, there's very little that can go wrong unless the engine stops or something like that. And then the pilot boat may pick up the pilot. If they haven't had experience with them, they'll go all the way out to the sea buoy, and then the pilot will get off, and vice versa coming in.
I was hoping that Ned Teller was going to be here tonight, because we have a citizen here that is a retired pilot. He probably had 4 years in
He and
pilots.
I got together twice. I have so much information he's given me. And he is so neat, y'all. I hope you get to meet him. He and his wife Sherry they can tell you stories, and it's just fascinating being with them. And the experience and all the different things that he's also been a tugboat captain.
Yeah.
So he's gone up and down.
A lot of them started out as they spent time as tugboat captain. And Ned Teller, of course, wasn't just a pilot for so many decades himself. His father was a pilot. His uncle, his great uncle, he comes from a long line of pilots. pilot. As a matter of fact, the Teller home used to be right across from the Tarpon Inn, right next to the Coast Guard station for years and years. So maybe we can bring him back for some type of
Because
storytelling.
he's been here before. hasn't
Right,
he?
yeah, he's coming, he's done our storytelling during the Old Town Festival. You have a question over there?
Have there been any casualties or ships that have been grounded or?
Well, yeah. It's interesting if you go back into the early pilot records, because they will talk about ships that got grounded. And so then they turn into lifesavers, and they go out, and they talk in detail about getting people off the St. Mary's,
Yeah, the Mary.
off of that. And also pilots, especially this particular, if you get to read the Mercer letters, which I think y'all have copies of,
We're down to our last 5 or 6.
they're really fascinating, because the pilots back then competed. There would be like 2 or 3 families that were pilots, and so whoever got the boat out to the ship the quickest got to be the pilot, and then you charge for certain, however deep the ship was, and you charge, so that's where you got your livelihood, but they were always fighting each other, competing. And then, if there was a ship that grounded, that the pilots were always angry, especially if the ship captain had not requested a pilot, because back
That was
then.
the Mary.
Yeah,
He thought he was capable, he had made that run quite a few times, and thought he could make it in. It was very rough, he didn't want to wait for the pilot. There was a northern blowing really a pretty good gale, and he didn't make it, and ended up breaking the boat.
so it's fun reading about the competition and other ships that, or other captains that were too cheap to, and the pilots just, hate them. But it's fun to read it, and, there have been even, I know several times that Bastille Bridge, I was telling y'all about, into the port of Corpus Christi, that has been hit fairly periodically. And it got to be another reason why they really wanted to replace it, with the harbor bridge and widen things a little bit. You had
I had another question. So in the early days, you talk about requesting pilots, but did they have radio communication?
that's what the flags were.
Oh, that's what they was
And that, to me, I couldn't, I keep thinking of the flags, and then when did radio communication come in? When it came in, when radios were really beginning to become commercial and accepted in the 20s and everything, is basically when they started being used on ships and pilot boats. But flags were used for the longest time, because everybody needs flags, And the Fort Aransas Museum has this really wonderful book that was put out by the British Admiralty back in the 1870s that has all the flags on it, which I will return you all, I promise.
I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
We have a chaplain that has most of the signal flags, but not all of them.
Yeah.
How close do the ships pass each other in a jetty?
You mean right now?
Yeah,
How close?
yeah, because
I'm not
it
sure
looks
what
like
the
they're pretty
difference
close,
is.
like you can't be too far
Yeah,
apart.
you can't be too far apart, and of course, the controlling depth is 54 feet in the very center. And that's, that extends a pretty good ways in the jetties, but sometimes narrows significantly after they make the turn. So it may depend on where they are in the channel. In the jetties, they probably have a little more room. And I've seen ships pass. You don't want to go too close because I think they call it it's a Venturi effect. If the ships pass too close to each other, they'll suck toward each other. So they have to maintain a minimum distance to avoid that happening. And of course, there's a point on the edges of the channel where it starts rising up in height. So it also depends on what their depth is. If they're at maximum draft and they need almost all that 54 feet, they're going to pass a lot closer than if they're only crafting 30 feet, because that goes a significantly further distance out to the edges. That's a good question.
I'm curious, do you have any idea what the average salary today is of these pilots?
Actually, I asked Ned, and I never really got an answer. And one of the things that is good though, because now they're all organized into a group, so there's not the competition. And they also have it worked out to where you may, whatever ship's coming in, if you're on duty that time, you go. Even though it may be sort of a smaller ship, as opposed to one that's really, really deep. And the rates are about the same, but now that they're in a group, they make it equitable for all of the pilots.
I know it used to be starting salaries were about over 200,000. So it's a really good paying job. I'm pretty sure that's accurate. It might be closer to 250. And that might just be starting salary too. So it was really important to get that invitation to participate.
Yeah, I heard that there are these families that you talked about, that still is kind of the case, that the families that own the business kind of keep the business very close. Is that what you found out in your research?
I can't answer exactly the ways you want. I know that the people who have been pilots are very close knit.
Right.
And the one like the Tellers and the Mercers before them and Rumbles.
Listers.
And the Listers. Those that still have members of their family that are interested in it are very, very full of pride, I don't think there's as much monopoly, but there's such a sense of joy that the family has continued this. But as far as, not monopoly anymore, although there are tinges of that, there's still kind of carryovers,
And secret handshake.
But I do know Ned, he'll mention that he has relatives like their pilots in Galveston. So there's some relationships, family relationships do play a part in the legacy of getting into the pilot organizations. You have to know somebody as a pilot to get in.
Yes.
which is kind of true a lot of times.
This is a shameless plug for the museum. If you think this was interesting, you should go to the museum and look into wreck reports of the sailing vessels back when we had a life-saving service before the Coast Guard, and how many wrecks there were, because people said, I can get in the channel and I don't need a plow. And lots of people died, and it's just fascinating. And we have all this stuff, and you get the original stuff, and you look at it on the computer. So if you want to spend some time really learning something, it's kind of cool.
And which those are located in the.
Well, just look at life-saving service, United States Life-Saving Service,
I think it's
USLSS, and it'll all pop up.
Now, the term Aransas, we think, came from the Basque word Aransas. So the early Spanish explorers, a lot of times the Basques were like the top-notch sailors. And basically translates to thorny place, because it's such a difficult pass to get in and out, because it was changing its shape, its depth, and its location till we have the jetties, and the history of that alone is pretty incredible.
I don't want to, I appreciate the shameless plug, and it is priority over mine. But my shameless plug is Texas A&M University in Galveston trains captains, and I have a retired friend who was a harbor pilot at Port of Freeport, and those guys are on call 24/7 for whatever their 5 days is, and then they can, I don't know how they do that, but I mean, they work, if they're not on duty, they're on call, and it's a rotating shift. Thank you, sir, for your shameless
mentioned the scow schooners, and if you haven't been to the Florida Boat Works, we're building a replica of the scow schooner. You can actually see exactly what she was talking about. And of course, at the museum, we have over 37,000 images, not just record reports, but we have a huge amount of pilot pictures, and of course, the Mercers. We've got quite a bit from them, so you're welcome to come in sometimes. But I'll warn you, if you're coming in to look at our archive pictures, you might as well bring a cup of coffee and plan on some time where you can just sit down, because it can be really, almost hypnotic going through those folders. There's just some incredible pictures. And not only the pictures of what you're looking for, but then you see things in the background and behind that you weren't looking for, that might give you a clue to something else that you were thinking about. So, pretty incredible. All right, let's have one more round of applause.